Hi everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Japanese Phonetics by Dogen. In this video, I will talk about my Japanese educational background, using the topic to provide context for the structure and content of this series. While talking about my Japanese learning experiences, I will mention several Japanese language programs. I encourage you to watch this video in its entirety before you leave to check these resources, and you'll understand why as the video continues. I began to study Japanese by myself during 8th grade. I bought the Oxford Take-Off in Japanese program, which includes 4 cassette tapes and 1 textbook, from a local used bookstore, and I went through the program until I finished it. I did a single lesson each night immediately before bed, and repeated lessons whenever I didn't feel confident in the content. Oxford's Take-Off in Japanese is a very good program, and I highly recommend it for anyone looking to get started with Japanese. It does use romaji rather than hiragana, katakana, and kanji, but I don't believe this is a particularly bad thing, and we'll explain why in a bit. After finishing the Oxford series, I tried several other programs such as Pimsleur Japanese, Rosetta Stone. I felt that all of them were quite slow, disorganized, and most of all, vapid. I stopped actively studying Japanese when I started martial arts tricking during my first year of high school, but I continued to listen to Japanese music every day and spent 5 to 10 hours each week watching a Japanese internet TV show that Avex, one of the major record labels in Japan, used to broadcast. The first time I ever took a Japanese class was during my second year of college at the University of Washington. As I had not been actively studying Japanese for a long time, and because my go-to resource for Japanese was a romaji-based program, I didn't perform well on the placement test and ended up placing into Japanese 101, so Introduction to Japanese. While taking this class, I also signed up for Linguistics 101. It was during this course that I learned 2 things which fundamentally changed my Japanese study habits. Point 1, writing systems. Around half of the languages in the world do not have a writing system. Despite this, these languages are considered living languages. While a living language can be spoken but not written, it cannot be written but not spoken. To put things simply, this knowledge led me to believe that the essence of language lied in spoken language, in the case of oral languages. A spoken Japanese word can be represented by Chinese characters, Japanese characters, the Roman alphabet, the International Phonetic Alphabet, etc. But no matter how you write or do not write the word, the spoken language itself does not change. And point 2, the brain's ability to accurately mimic spoken language deteriorates greatly over time. I knew this before taking this course, as do most people, but learning about this phenomenon with explicit numbers and academic studies, in combination with the aforementioned points, spurred me to actually change my study habits. As developing a Japanese native-like accent was one of my goals at the time, I suddenly felt a sense of urgency and decided to put all of my efforts into phonetics and basically postpone everything else until I felt that my Japanese pronunciation and pitch accent was close to native, within the scope of my lexicon or vocabulary at that particular time. Rather than trying to memorize a lot of kanji or get a high grade in Japanese 101, I rented PM Suski's Phonetics of Japanese Language from the university library and spent the majority of my total study hours alone concentrating on pronunciation. I intentionally did this slowly as I wanted to properly process the information, and also because I was very busy with other classes, tricking, which was my primary passion at the time, and also my part-time job. As time passed, I became more and more interested in Japanese phonetics, and eventually I decided to change my major from international business to Japanese linguistics. That being said, the Japanese linguistics major at the University of Washington deals more with morphology, syntax, and social linguistics than phonology or phonetics, so my ongoing phonetic studies were almost always done outside of class. I studied abroad at Keio University in Tokyo during my junior year of college. When I arrived in Japan, I was about where I thought I would be in terms of language ability. I placed into a lower level class, but my accent was comparable, if not better, than most of the students in the intermediate and even some of the advanced classes. However, I still wasn't satisfied with my speaking abilities and strongly believed that I should spend my entire year abroad concentrating on speaking rather than, again, kanji or advanced grammar. So I did several things. One, I took as few classes as possible such that I could surround myself with Japanese natives rather than foreigners trying to learn Japanese. Two, I pestered my Japanese teachers to teach me pitch accent until they opened the first of its kind pitch accent class. And three, I moved out of Keio's international dorm and began a homestay with a Japanese family. During my year in Tokyo, I studied hard, and by the time I got on my return flight to Seattle, I felt as though I was conversationally fluent in Japanese. That is to say, I could understand and partake in most everyday conversations at a natural speed. Moreover, I felt that my Japanese accent was among the best of the students studying abroad that year, including those who had passed the N1 test and were taking not Japanese classes, but normal classes such as economics in Japanese. Naturally, these students' reading, writing, and advanced communication abilities were far greater than my own. I went back to the States, finished my degree in Japanese linguistics, then I moved back to Japan on the JET program. By this time, I felt as though I had reached a point of diminishing returns with regards to phonetic study, and finally decided to switch my focus to reading and writing. I spent almost all of my time during my full 3 years on the JET program writing short stories in Japanese and getting them corrected by native speakers through a website such as Language 8, which I introduced on a previous Dogen video. I stopped studying both spoken and written Japanese and began to focus solely on creative writing in Japanese, which I have been doing for about 4 or 5 years now, albeit almost entirely unprofessionally. I currently work at a Japanese university as the only non-Japanese member of the school's domestic admissions team, and am married to a Japanese woman, though we speak both Japanese and English at home. So, to sum up my Japanese educational history, I studied conversational Japanese by myself for about 1.5 years during my early teens. I kept myself exposed to native Japanese through music, TV shows, and movies throughout high school. I studied Japanese phonetics intensively throughout college, mostly outside of class. I spent my first year out of college playing catch-up with written Japanese, and I have spent all of my time since then writing short stories and essays in Japanese and working and living in a mostly Japanese environment. I strongly believe that intentionally limiting my initial Japanese studies to phonetics is why my spoken Japanese is at its current level. I was able to avoid a lot of the bad speaking habits most people develop immediately when studying the language comprehensively. Again, you can learn kanji or archaic grammar anytime, but it becomes comparatively more difficult to mimic foreign language sounds as you get older, and even harder to fix bad habits once they have been established. In fact, it's actually harder to forget your bad habits than it is to establish good ones. This is why I don't believe that using Takeoff in Japanese, a Romaji-based Japanese resource, was a particularly bad thing. It allowed me to focus all of my attention on what was being said, rather than making me split my attention between listening and reading, or speaking and writing. Here's where things get semi-controversial. Take all of the following with a grain of salt, and remember that I'm trying to sell you a phonetics-based program. I believe that if your end goal is to develop a native-like accent, it's unproductive to split your study hours equally between speaking and writing, especially at the beginner and intermediate level. I believe that every time you learn a new word without memorizing the pitch accent pattern, you are potentially developing a bad phonetic habit. So assuming you aren't a language savant and that you didn't have the luxury of living in a Japanese environment during your childhood, I believe that in order to sound native or close to native, you have to study phonetics as soon as possible, and that you have to take these studies seriously. If you are currently studying Japanese and hope to eventually speak with little to no foreign accent, my personal advice would be to throttle down on your kanji and vocabulary studies and to allocate this time to memorizing pitch, accent, and pronunciation patterns. Look to Vince Lombardi for inspiration. Practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. Use phonetic knowledge and an intentionally staggered study plan to nip your gaijin accent in the bud. I hope that my series, Japanese Phonetics, becomes one of the many resources you use to accomplish this. And that's all for this lesson. In Lesson 3, I will be covering common misconceptions with regards to Japanese phonetics. In Lesson 4, I will be covering phonetic awareness and useful phonetic practices. And in Lesson 5, I will begin to introduce Japanese pitch accent terminology. The various free third-party resources you can use to supplement your phonetic studies will come shortly after that. Thank you for your continued support and see you again soon.